Good evening and welcome everybody to our second installment, a multi-part series that we have begun that we call the Bygone Bars, the story of American culture and camaraderie. We, as we entered into these pandemic times, we began doing virtual tours as our obviously in-person ones fell away, and we found that we actually quite enjoyed doing them because it allowed us to expand our reach, able to go beyond just as far as a person can walk or as long as a human being's bladder can handle a walk. And we've been able to spread out a little bit. And so we're taking advantage of it to really dig into some of the research and some of the stories that we don't always get to share on some of our in-person tours while we await for things to straighten out. This evening series of Bygone Bars, we're going a little nostalgic here and we're viewing some of the bars that are no longer around that used to be part of our tour back in the day, with the exception of one that is still around that unfortunately due to their success in gentrification is not something that we can really easily manage to bring our tours into anymore. So it is an opportunity to catch it while it lasts. But for some of these others, if you were ever on our tour at the beginning back in 1998, you may recognize a few of those. But I'm Eric, I'm one of your hosts, and I would love to introduce the other three members of the team who are here with us today. If you would unmute your cameras, which is still a matter of debate on whether or not that's the appropriate phrase to say, but I still say it, to turn on your camera, unmute your camera, as you will. Joining us today on my left is Rose Merritt. She actually joined us because she attended one of our virtual tours, and she asked if we needed volunteers, which we always do. And we were grateful to have her. She jumped in, and honestly, a lot of our material is better because of her eye. She's put into a lot of work to it. She has some really great insights, especially being outside of the tour with some of the material that I've done for years and know so well. It's nice to hear an outside view. So she's really elevated a lot of our experience, and we're grateful to have her. We also, diagonally to my left, would be Rebecca Ross Bailey, who hails from my alma mater of the University of Maine at Orono, performed on stage at Penobscot Theater, which is one of my first, which was my first professional theatrical experience. Yours.
Yeah,
was it?
Yeah.
Do you remember what show it was?
The Children's Hour.
The Children's Hour.
Very
Lillian
nice.
Hoffman. Very nice.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Mine was it's not for the good of the nation. It's the one with the newspapers and the anarchist. It's set in the 1920s. Oh, it's gonna drive me nuts now.
Not State of the Union, right?
Not State of the Union.
A
long time ago.
We'll send it in the follow-up email.
That's right. I know everyone's dying to know about my theatrical past, so I can't wait to regale you with boring tours of career unsuccess. But yeah, Rebecca, she's absolutely wonderful. She brings so much energy and fun to the tour. Anytime that I've made a deadline, I do a lot of the work. I update the website, I update the Zoom, update all our links. I take care of all of that stuff, and I do it on time because Rebecca says, "Hey, are you going to get that done?" And she'll send me a text to remind me. I'm like, "Yep, I'm on it. Thank you." So between the two ladies to my left, they're really kind of keeping this on track, and it's why this is still a success. And then right below me is, of course, Kurt Kingsley, who actually started as a guide on the tour before I started on the tour. I was acting with the company and drinking on the tour quite regularly. And Kurt joined up a little bit later, began acting and guiding, and then I started guiding along with everyone else. He's a Shakespearean trained actor from the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. He's been also a great addition. Now, all of us are basically volunteers for this right now. So we spend our time with our regular jobs trying to put this together in meetings late night. So I really appreciate everyone's efforts. Kurt is the exception. I'm actually billing him for my time tonight. So I'll be sending him an invoice a little bit later. And that's one of the ways that we make our money here. But with all of that being said, I'd like to kind of jump into it because I wanted to start us off and then really get to the good material when these three people all start talking. But I really appreciate you coming and joining us tonight. Many of you have seen several of our others. We're getting better at uploading them on YouTube, so I will be quicker, I promise, for this next one. But I do really appreciate all of you taking this time and returning to join us. But with that being said, I would like to start our nostalgic review of former bars of our tour at 359 6th Avenue, aka the Avenue of Americas. Now, I found a few of these pictures. I really quite like them from the 1930s. It's a little hard to tell. I like this picture because it has the L train that used to be there running down 6th Avenue. But 359 is not, it's not that you see the church Just to the left, across the street, is a building, and then next to that is the building in question. It's a Federalist-style building. It was built around 1832. This next slide will give you a little bit of a better shot, also from around that time period. Now, it's a little hard to tell, but you can see there's a big gap below the windows there. When it was built, it looked much like all of the other buildings around, but somewhere around the 19 teens or 20s, they took out the windows and bricked it up and got rid of it. Now, the reason for this is not because there was a popular architectural style of bricking up windows to get rid of all natural light and diminish it in workplaces and homes. It was actually due to prohibition. Prohibition was an attempt by the United States in 1919 to prevent people from drinking. It was met with some limited success around the country, and in New York City, it was basically met with disregard and laughter, which I think on that cue, we should enjoy a New York moment. Prohibition. Thank you so much. If you want to give you a sense of just how successful Prohibition was in New York City, one of the estimates is that when Prohibition kicked in 1919, there were about 16,000 places that served alcohol. By the time that it was repealed, they estimate there was over 100,000 of them. So here we see an example of someone speaking with ease in their speakeasy, and then this is the end result by the end of Prohibition of hundreds of thousands of people speaking with ease as they go in there. Now, drinking thrived in the city, and as you can see in this next slide here, there was another set of marching to defy the people protesting the prohibition and protesting their love of beer. What I find really funny about this is that if you go to the next slide, apparently there was a time when men loved their beer and protested, and women loved their beer and protested, but they just couldn't get together, which I think is actually very telling about the time period. Women's rights movements had really just kind of kicked off right before Prohibition, and ironically, Prohibition helped with the feminist movement and with the individuality, because prior to Prohibition, if you were a woman by yourself in a bar, you were arrested for prostitution, whether you were a prostitute or not. But once Prohibition came about and drinking was illegal for everyone, it was sort of fair game, and it was leveling the playing field. They actually say that it created a burst of social activity for men and women. There was music and dancing and jazz, that corrupting, evil, violent, and sexy form of music that was shocking the morals of the time period. And through all of this, you had the independent woman, and the flapper was born. Now, these themes run heavily in Fitzgerald, especially in his Tales of the Jazz Age. It really kind of popularized a lot of what was going on with the youth, and through several of his novels. There's actually a great quote in the Jazz Age that was published in 1922, where he really kind of popularized the term flapper girl. It had been around a little bit before, but he kind of brought it back and kind of made it a little savvier and less demeaning in some ways. But he wrote, "In the early morning of May the 2nd, it was unusually full. Over the marble-topped tables were bent the excited faces of flappers whose fathers owned individual villages. They were eating buckwheat cakes and scrambled eggs with relish and gusto, an accomplishment that it would have been utterly impossible for them to repeat in the same place 4 hours later." But all of this kind of brings us back to 359 6th Avenue and the bricking up of windows. For this address, it was the location of a very early speakeasy known as the Redhead. Now, some sources are saying that the reason why it was bricked up is because the speakeasy was actually up on the second floor, perhaps as a sort of depressing windowless abode. But others say that that's actually where they stored the kegs coming in from Canada with a secret back stair. But whatever the case, it was a speakeasy. It was a tea room, so they would serve alcohol in teacups. It was very popular. There were many, many speakeasies that were tea rooms, and in fact, that's part of why there was such a tea room craze for a while, because they were drinking much more than tea. But it was started by, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, actually, Jack Kreindler and Charlie Burns. You may recognize those names because they became fairly big names in the speakeasy world. They were finding a way to pay for college tuition. So they were going to night school, and they figured they'd raise money by selling alcohol, similar to what some people do with weed in college these days, I hear. So it's nice to see that trend kind of continues throughout cultural history. But because this location was getting raided so often, they ended up moving over to another location on 88 Washington Place, and they called the place Fronton's. And it was a hangout for more culturally iconic people like Edna St. Vincent Millay and Mayor Jimmy Walker. Now, this area also started to have some problems. So they moved up to 42nd Street and they started the Punch-In. But then Rockefeller Center wanted to move in. So they actually paid Jack and Charlie about $11,000 to move up to the 42nd Street to 21 West 52nd Street. And thus we have Jack and Charlie's 21 Club. This was a very, and I think it just recently closed, although its fate is still up for debate. I'm not sure if anyone else has any updates on it, but I know there was like, it's closing, and then it wasn't closing, and now it's closing again. And I think it may end up being a victim of, yes, not to be made with Punch-In. But at any rate, 359 6th Avenue in the 60s ended up becoming a place called McBell's. And this is where we enter in the pub crawl, not quite in the 60s, many years later. And you can really see that gap in the windows here in this pictures. But McBell's was opened apparently by a Frank Fritz Campbell and his cousin, who was a McDonald. I don't know his cousin's first name, but thus we have the Mick and the Bell from McDonald and Campbell. Now they opened up this Irish pub. Yeah, here's a great shot of Francis there now near the end. But it was sort of ironic because in the 60s they opened up a whole block of bars, and just a block away was an English pub down the block from an Irish pub in the 1960s. And this English pub called the London Pub, of course, had already been around for a while. But one of the newspapers, when they were talking about McBell's, sort of savvily said that despite the cultural clash, there were no rebellions to be had on that block of 6th Avenue. Now, if you go over to this next slot, you kind of see what the bar kind of looked like near the final years when the tour was going there. We went there from 98 until it kind of closed down in 2000. And it was one of the bars that was most memorable for me the first time I actually went on the tour, which I think was the third tour that ever happened. It was you walk in and you can kind of see the pictures on the left there of this. There were all these great black and white pictures of old New York. You could really get a sense of the 20s with the bar, and it just felt like a sort of a neighborhood local dive New York bar, and it was. One of the bigger literary names to come out of McBell's was Joseph Campbell. Now, he was a regular. He lived around the corner, and he easily fit in with the McBell's crowd. He was apparently, despite when he was older, his very stern gesturing, he was a very personable guy, and he loved talking at bars. He loved chatting up literature and philosophy, and so he ended up getting into a good friendship with a longtime bartender, Bruce Baumwell. We saw him earlier with the owner. Here's Bruce again. Now, Bruce actually has an active blog even now. He's been doing it for about 10 years. It's all sorts of random reminiscence about different times of his life, but he had a little snippet about his time at McBell's, mostly through Joseph Campbell, and how their friendship really grew. And Campbell turned him on to a lot of different authors, including a lot of Jewish authors, some of whom he had not been aware of before, including Viktor Frankl was one of the novels he read thanks to Joseph Campbell. Now, Baumwell used to say that the neighborhood was a down-to-earth bar, and so you had a lot of neighborhoods coming in there, but you also had a lot of relatively big celebrities or soon to be big celebrities and literary giants who were coming there because they could kind of just eat and be left alone. He said that lots of people came because of the burger, but really they all came because they loved Francis Campbell. Baumwell actually joked that he was the only Jewish man working at an Irish bar, that he was a bagel in a world of shepherd pies. Now, Joseph Campbell, his writings focus heavily on mythology and philosophy. And as you kind of got a teaser there, his philosophy about myths, the masks of God and the hero with 1,000 faces really kind of delves into how there was a commonality between all myth and was a really big inspiration for Star Wars. Let's get back to that picture and sit on it. I'm not going to lie. I still think this is the best movie. It is still my favorite by far. I don't think you could make a movie like that now. It was meant to be made in the 70s. It was meant with that style. Yes, Empire is better written, Kurt. I know. Yes, there's a lot more inclusivity in some of the future stuff. The technology is so much better. Many of the movies are cartoons now, but there is something pure and innocent and beautiful about Star Wars, the 1977 movie. And I read an interesting article that suggested that perhaps it should only have been a one-off movie. Food for thought. Perhaps a little bit later on. But beyond that, I think Baumwell did sort of mention that Campbell, despite influencing Star Wars and many other authors, loved conversations about literature, life, and philosophy, but he also loved a bacon cheeseburger, medium rare, French fries, and a Molson's ale. Another great regular there in the acting world, which is one of the reasons why we love this place so much, was Uta Hagen. Now, if you've studied theater, if you are an actor, you know who Uta Hagen is. She's a highly recognizable name for anyone in the industry, especially on the performing side, and in most cases, a highly unrecognizable name for anyone who wasn't actually watching theater during the 1940s through the 60s. Now, part of that, she is actually best known because she originated the role of Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is still one of the most iconic plays that has come out of this country, up there with the Children's Hour, ironically enough. But she's known in the industry because she wrote a book called Respect for Acting, and it is still considered to be the preeminent actor's handbook, and it is taught in almost every theater program across the country to some degree or another. She was German-born, 1919, moved to the city in the 1930s, had a few acting jobs in the 30s, but really the 40s and 50s are when things took off for her. But one of the reasons why many people don't recognize the name is because she wasn't a huge Hollywood star. And part of the reason for that is that she was on the notorious Hollywood blacklist. This is a period of time where the government was concerned about socialism and communism and free thought. And so they really blacklisted a lot. And this leads right up to the Red Scare and the McCarthy years, and just that real blight on free speech that happened during that time. Hagen's crime was really through her association with Paul Robeson. They worked together in Othello. She was the Desdemona to his Othello, and Paul Robeson had a lot of ties, as did a lot of African-American artists and actors and writers and thinkers of that time period, when you really started having that socialist and communist movement happening around the world. And part of it is because communism was embracing racial equality. They were actively courting African Americans and inviting them to speak and really treating them quite well. Whereas here in the States, there were bus seats and water fountains that Paul Robeson was not allowed to use. So there's no surprise that a lot of African American denizens were really kind of appealed by communism. Now, I found a couple, when I was researching McBell's, I happened across Uta Hagen and some of her students writing some reminiscence about going to class with her. She took off as an actor, especially later in life. And even though she acted throughout the 70s and 80s to a degree, she really became a teacher, and that became the mark that she left in the industry. She taught people like Matthew Broderick, Jack Lemmon, Liza Minnelli, Sigourney Weaver, Jon Stewart, and even Al Pacino. One of her students sort of mentioned that they would always go to McBell's after classes, and they would talk heavily about the industry and reminisce about, the old days and great moments in acting. But God forbid if she ever were to order a chamomile tea and not a proper drink, because Uta Hagen would let her have it. Another student also mentioned that she was demanding, she was harsh. If you weren't dedicated to be an actor, if you weren't, up to par, she had no problem kicking you out. She said she would suffer no fools. But she also truly loved the craft. She loved actors and artists, and she loved a beer and a burger at McBell's. And people who like classic, yes, Kurt.
I'd like to interject here. I did have a close encounter with Uta Hagen at one time. I actually auditioned for her class once. I was called back, and I got to audition for her in person. And she came in.
You saw the Uta?
I saw Uta. Uta saw me, but I have to say, she was notorious for bringing a small dog with her wherever she went. And the dog sat through my audition. And I think, I thought I did a great job, but apparently the dog was not impressed, and hence I did not get a spot in her class.
Do you think it's because the dog knew that you were a cat person?
The dog knew that I was a cat person. I reeked of cat.
Could you tell who was more enthralled, Uta or the dog? Who seemed to be paying more attention to you?
I think the dog actually was paying more attention, but not in a good way.
But that's cool that you auditioned for Uta.
Yeah, it was great. It was really, it was a once in a lifetime thing, I guess.
yeah. She wouldn't let you back in afterwards, huh?
No, not at all. Never.
Well, there's a few other notables that were also there. Maybe that Kurt also auditioned for. Madeline Sherwood, who played a fairly large role. I mean, she wasn't in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. She wasn't Elizabeth Taylor, obviously, because she's not. She's Madeline Sherwood with Paul Newman, but she was in that original production in the film and the stage version. And also Elaine Stritch, who is just sort of an iconic classy and sassy dame in the world of theater. And she, it was actually one newspaper remarked that she went to McBell's regularly, but she was never there with less than 6 companions who were eating and drinking with her. So she certainly knew how to entertain. Now, after closing McBell's, there was a few other places that kind of popped up. Camolo's briefly, and actually we tried to go to Camolo's for a little bit, but it didn't last very long. And then it became a victim of the Tex-Mex craze. So you had La Palapa that was there, you had Tertulia that was there, and now I believe it's a Japanese and Peruvian fusion restaurant called La Masan, which I have not been in, but from the pictures I've seen, like every bar you slowly see it degrading from McBell's into something new. And I think now it's probably almost unrecognizable except for the exterior. No idea what the food is like, and I'm sure they're very nice people who are running it. So I speak no ill of La Masan, but I do wax nostalgic for the Bygone bar of McBell's.
No.
That was pretty good, right? I just came up with that on the spot.
Yeah, very nice.
Well, thank you, Kurt. Well, since you complimented Sully so well, I would love for you to take over for me and talk about another great bar that was from our original first tour.
Oh, yes, the Cedar Tavern. Excuse me for a second. I just have to move the cat. Excuse me. Ah,
Uda's turning in her grave.
yes, well, she can turn all she wants. And now, the Cedar Tavern. The Cedar has been described as, quote, an enchanted place, the quintessential smoky bar, the New York neighborhood joint of yesteryear, where a group of scrappy, brilliant, starving artists once gathered to smoke cigarettes, drink bottomless cups of cheap coffee, and change the world by transmogrifying themselves into the mythological beings known as the abstract expressionists. What a beautiful dream, and some of it is even factual. So, to the history. The Cedar Tavern, or as it was originally known, the Cedar Street Bar, opened in 1866 on Cedar Street, as you might expect, downtown near the New York Stock Exchange. In 1933, the year Prohibition ended, it moved north to 55 West 8th Street into the Village. Then in 1945, it moved east to 24 University Place. And I believe they still had the same awning out front that said the Cedar Street Bar. It was at this time, around 1955, Sam DiLiberto purchased the bar. And luckily it was located mere feet from the Village Voice offices. So he had lots of business from the Village Voice. This location is where most of the stories of the Cedar Tavern come from. Now, in 1963, apparently there was a fire, and it was moved once again up 3 blocks north to 82 University Place, owned now by Sam's sons, Michael and Joe DiLiberto. In December of 2006, the Cedar Tavern closed yet again, and this time to allow for the construction of a 7-story addition to the building in which it was housed. Michael and Joe said that they were definitely going to reopen in 6 months, but they never did. Now, not all neighbors were upset about this, and in fact, one even said it pretty much had run its course. None of the people who made it what it was were coming there anymore.
Like
Now,
us.
Like
for
us.
that matter.
And we'll get into that later. But
ever since we stopped going there, the whole place it had run its course.
You know, not only had it run its course, it was then torn down to the ground. So you know.
That'll teach you.
And I'm pretty sure it's because we no longer went there. But anyway, it was at this location at 88 University Place that Michael and Joe installed this beautiful mahogany bar that you can see here. And it became kind of the defining feature of the Cedar Tavern, as it was known then. The bar itself was over 150 years old. It originally came from the Susquehanna Hotel on Wall Street. When the hotel closed, the bar went into storage. And then in 1963, Sam found it and brought it out and brought it to the Cedar Tavern. And in 2006, the 50-foot bar was then sold and taken apart into hundreds of pieces, transported by movers of fine art and stored for 10 years. And in 2016, it was brought out of storage to serve as the centerpiece of the Eberly restaurant in Austin, Texas, specifically at 615 South Lamar, if you want to go visit it. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I had worried for the longest time of what actually was going to happen to that bar when I saw that it closed. And it's nice to see that it's actually been lovingly restored, and it's now the centerpiece of another bar. So
it's sad that it's not in the village, but it is like I will go and have another drink at that bar someday, and I'll probably choke up a little bit.
yeah, same here. And I have to say that it's probably in a better place simply because of the lack of humidity. So if nothing else. So, but this then brings us to another feature of the Cedar Tavern, the phone booth. Now, the phone booth at the Cedar Tavern was the only part of the bar at 24 University Place that actually survived the move to its location at 82 University Place. Therefore, the phone booth was the true witness to the stories at the Cedar, such as when Jackson Pollock ripped the bathroom door off its hinges and threw it at Franz Klein, or when Kerouac was thrown out for urinating in an ashtray. Later, it was witness to the bar becoming a hangout for New York actors, writers, musicians like Frank McDara, Herbert Huncke, F. Murray Abram, Matt Dillon, Bernard Pretty Purdy, Winona Ryder, and even Brad Pitt. The double punch of Hurricanes Irene in 2011 and Sandy in 2012 damaged the phone booth in storage, and it was then disassembled, and the parts were given to artists to create pieces based on the Cedar Tavern and New York City during its beatnik and abstract expressionist heydays. That's very nice. Yeah. I have to say that the hurricanes not only damaged the phone booth, but I don't know if you remember when we would walk up the street and then around the corner, there was a really beautiful wisteria bush, a vine that would climb up one of the apartments that we crossed. And I believe Sandy actually brought that vine down as well. It's too bad.
I don't remember that.
I wish I'd taken a photograph of it. It was gorgeous. Everybody, when it was blooming, would stop and just stare at it. It was great.
I wish you had two, Kurt. And the number of times that I ask you to please just take a picture, and
I know.
I just don't know what else. I don't know how many times to say it.
I know. That's, well, too late now.
We've let all of these people down.
It's true. It's true. I feel terrible. Can I continue?
Yes, I guess.
Oh,
so.
Okay, thank you. Now, moving on to the who's who. Now, the Cedar is often called New York's most famous artist bar, the center of American Bohemia. And it was the main hangout for abstract painters of the 50s and 60s. Even as its alternatives and its successors disappeared, like the San Remo, Dillon's, the Five Spot, the Lion's Head, Max's Kansas City, the Cedar managed to survive a little bit longer than the rest of them. Despite the passing years, it retained its reputation as the place where American pioneers of modern art once held court, despite the fact that the actual location where they gathered was 3 blocks down the street at 24 University Place. One of the reasons it was a focal point was Robert Motherwell had a studio nearby in the early 50s, and he held weekly salons for artists. And the Cedar was the closest place in their neighborhood to get coffee, booze if they could afford it, or if they were really doing well, they could get food. Now, the regulars liked it for its cheap drinks and lack of tourists in middle-class squares. And University Place in those days was actually kind of down market. There were single-room occupancy hotels and flop houses, and it was a little down at heel. And this was the 24 University Place location, and the interior consisted of little more than a narrow bar in the front, hideous green walls, no jukebox, lousy burgers, and it had all the ambiance of an emergency room. Where you sit in chairs and you got those really unforgiving
That was not where I thought you were going with this, but I like.
No, but I mean, I look at the pictures and it's like, yeah, it's like I'm waiting to have a boil lanced or something. So
I have to ask though, Kurt, hold on. So
Yes.
you said that Robert Motherwell, he would hold weekly what for artists?
salons.
Is that what you said? I thought you said salon. It
No,
sounded like you said a
salon.
salon for weekly
No, I
artists.
said, isn't that how it's pronounced, Eric? A
Salon style for
Yeah,
salon hair.
Hmm.
I think I say salons.
Do you say salons?
I say salons.
That's too bad.
But I guess when saying it, what was that, Becca?
You're just not French enough for us. I
No,
suppose.
I'm sorry.
I'm not classy. It's very working class, I guess.
Okay,
Okay, well,
Salon.
working class, yeah, it was a salon. Yeah. Okay. But or you could say it was just a hangout.
There you go. The
Yeah.
gathering.
Sure.
Also, are we defining all the bars so far by their quality of burgers? Because I'm kind of catching a
Apparently, this is a running theme. Yeah. And
burger bars.
apparently, this is not one of the winners. So among the artists in the 50s, I'm going to continue if it's okay.
Yeah, go for it. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I can't help it. Interrupting it just amuses me.
Okay. It was the kind of place where cash-strapped artists and cultural outcasts could feel at home. Among the artists in the 1950s, you might find Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Grace Hartigan, Mark Rothko, and others of the New York School. It was also popular with writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Gregory Corso, Frank O'Hara, George Plimpton, Leroy and Hetty Jones. And in the 60s, this would be then when it moved uptown, a little further up on University Place, Tully Kupferberg of the Fugues and David Amram would show up there, and occasionally Bob Dylan. And D.A. Pennebaker and Dylan and Bob Newworth met there to plan the shooting of their 1967 documentary, Don't Look Back. The artist Elaine de Kooning, wife of Willem de Kooning, referred to it as the epicenter of a decade-long bender. Artist Ad Reinhardt explained, "We go there to meet the people we hate the most, other painters." And Frank O'Hara recalled that we were all in our 20s. John Ashbery, Barbara Guest, Kenneth Koch, and I, being poets, we divided our time between the literary bar, the San Remo, and the artist bar, the Cedar Tavern. In the San Remo, we argued and gossiped. In the Cedar, we often wrote poems while listening to painters argue and gossip. Now, recounting how the painter Milton Resnick challenged Pollock to step outside after the latter accused Resnick of being a de Kooning imitator, Andy Warhol wrote, "I tried to imagine myself in a bar striding over to, say, Roy Lichtenstein and asking him to step outside because I heard him insulting my soup cans." I mean, how corny.
That's solid.
Warhol was always level-headed. He was he had a really good grounded
yeah.
perspective on human relations.
And life in general.
I think
And
that we need you to do the rest of the tour in the Warhol voice. That was amazing.
I would love to do our little encounter between Bob Dylan and Andy Warhol, but I'm sorry we can't do the fight choreography. So too bad. Now there are some pop references to the Cedar Tavern. Augustine Burroughs refers to the last location, 82 University Place, in his memoir Dry. Kurt Vonnegut uses the Cedar Tavern as a meeting place of a fictional artist, Rabo Karabekian, and his abstract expressionist painter friends in Bluebeard. Author Dawn Powell uses the Cedar Tavern as a model for her book, The Golden Spur. Oh, that's very nice.
Yes, thank you.
And we have a small excerpt here. This is a scene at the bar between a patron and the bartender. "Painters have got to drink, especially these days," Earl observed. "A painter can't turn out the stuff they do now without being loaded. The bartender subtracted a fresh supply of pennies from the board and pushed another beer across the counter. That's where you're wrong, Earl. I know more about artists than you do. After all, I'm the bartender here. The way I size it up is that they gotta paint sober. Then they're so disgusted with what they've done, they gotta get stoned and wreck the joint, said Earl. Look at the crack in that table where Hugo and Lou Schaefer bashed it in. Jonathan looked admiringly at the damaged table indicated. The place sure seems quiet with Hugo out of town. The bartender sighed. Oh, what the hell. Painting's no kind of work for those guys. They gotta let off steam, beat up their girl, kick in a door. It's only human nature as I sees it. Sure, said Jonathan. Human nature, that's all. Artists get away with more human nature than anybody else, Earl muttered morosely to Jonathan.
You know, that the setting of that book, I believe that's the one where it's someone from the Midwest, a young man who's convinced that he's a writer and convinced that his father's not his real biological father because his father's lame. And he's convinced that his mother had an affair with a writer in New York City. So he goes to New York, and it's like a literary version of Midnight Cowboy with all of his escapades and everyone thinking they're taking advantage of, and he's innocently just succeeding through New York, being taken advantage of by all of the locals. It's quite funny.
They should make a movie out of that.
They should.
Oh, well, speaking of the screen, the cast of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel in season 2, the title of that particular episode is Look, She Made a Hat, which I believe is a reference to Sunday in the Park with George, which is also about a painter. Benjamin takes Midge to the Cedar Tavern to introduce her to the New York art world. Now, the scene is not shot at the Cedar Tavern, of course, because it didn't exist, but it was actually shot in McSorley's, which is actually a real feast for the eyes. It's the lighting is much more warm. It's more rustic. It really is. It's a fun episode too.
Yeah, it's a great episode.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
Yep.
The Cedar Tavern appears in Joyce Johnson's Minor Characters, her memoir about Jack Kerouac. And in Jonathan Franzen's Corrections, Chip Lambert steals $9 from a Cedar Tavern bartender to pay for a cab to Tribeca.
Nice.
All right.
Well, thank you, Kurt, and thank you to the Cedar Tavern. And I think like 2 bars down is always a good time for a toast for those people who wanted to join us with a drink. We have a couple of here that we've been always trying to research new ones because I regurgitate the same old ones, but I found one that seemed somewhat apropos. Here's to staying positive and testing negative.
Oh,
cheers. Oh, take that as you will. Hemingway actually once wrote that I drink to make other people more interesting. But because I'm a sap and I like the touching elements, there's a favorite little poem that's, I don't know if it's a toast, but I'll still share it, from the illustrious Shel Silverstein, who wrote, how many slams in an old screen door depends how loud you shut it. How many slices in a bread depends how thin you cut it. How many good inside a day depends how good you live them. How much love inside a friend depends how much you give them. Cheers.
cheers.
And at this note, I do want to, I'm going to be taking over the screen here for a second, but I did want to, for a serious moment, just say, I do really appreciate you coming. We're going to try to keep doing more of these. I wanted to give you a little bit of a backstage feel without sort of the overproduction, to just see that all of the work that goes into putting this together, and because I just think it's really cool that I could switch cameras in the middle of doing all of this. But it does mean a lot that you're here. If you are enjoying this, and if you continue to enjoy the last half of this, we would ask, as you hear more, to encourage some other people to join up. Obviously, these are free and will remain free as long as we do them, unless for some reason we can really make a lot of money at it, but I don't see that happening. So please encourage others to come. And in the meantime, I'm going to pass it over to Rose as I take over the screen here and run the PowerPoint.
It is not I.
Rose, did you want to go next, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. My apologies. It is not Rose. It is Becca. Where are you taking us, Becca?
Well, I'm actually just going to pass it right over to Kurt, if that sounds good.
Who runs this thing anymore? I don't understand.
Your tavern again. Oh,
willy-nilly. As to set up the next bar that we're going to go to, I'd love to have one of our guides read a passage that is just so beautiful, and it's by David Amram, who we heard about earlier. Would anyone mind reading this passage. Oh, Kurt.
Do you want to do it one more time, Kurt? You haven't been with us for a while.
Come on, get in here.
I will do one more and then I will shut up.
And then you're done, we promise.
Yep. I'm going to start drinking after this.
Perfect.
Okay. 8th Street at night. When Jack Kerouac and I were strolling down McDougal Street one night in the 50s, he paused and pointed to the sparkling slivers of metal embedded in the litter-strewn asphalt. "Look at the diamonds in the sidewalk, Davy," he said. Jack was referring to some of the hidden treasures in New York that we all felt surrounded us in the most exciting and glamorous city in the world. A half century later, I still treasure playing on the first Monday of every month at the Cornelia Street Cafe, 2 blocks where I first played with Charlie Mingus, the quintet at the old Cafe Bohemia. The Cornelia Street Cafe is more elegant and user-friendly than any of the places that Kerouac and I used to hang out in. But there is a warm spirit and a cozy atmosphere that reminds you that in the great megalopolis of New York, small is still beautiful. When I go out at night, at the end of the night to pack up my instruments, I walk underneath the nearest street light and I always see those diamonds in the sidewalk still glittering as they did so long ago and welcoming anyone walking by to feel at home as Jack and I always did. Oh, yeah.
So much, Kurt.
I just love it. The diamonds in the sidewalk, just to be able to see.
You know, the reason I wanted to share that too is because one of the things I loved about the tour so much was the just like physical presence of the magic, right? No matter what location we went to. And so I feel like it's hard to capture that virtually, but some of these pieces give us that sensation, that tangible feeling, which I really love. Thank you for reading that, Kurt.
My pleasure. Thanks.
So our next stop, as Kurt just introduced, is the Cornelia Street Cafe, which is sadly no longer on our tour. And located at 29 Cornelia Street, this site has a history that is boozy and sordid and full of evil, greedy landlords. So we are going to explore why this cafe, which was once thriving and notably an epicenter for creativity in the village for over 4 decades, is now an empty, abandoned building. So Cornelia Street itself dates back to about 1794, where it served as a property divider between 2 sisters, Sarah and its namesake Cornelia Herring, on what was known as the Herring Farm. Now, this is not like a farm that you would think of, nor was it a place to breed fish, but rather a large piece of property that belonged to one family of Dutch colonists that stretched from the Bowery on the east to Christopher Street on the west. And it actually included a very large chunk of what would become Washington Square Park. And it was the Herring family who sold that piece of land to the city to be used as a potter's field or the graveyard for the poor. And I know a lot of you out there probably already know this, but the next time that you were in Washington Square Park and just admiring the music and taking in the artists and the hordes of people, it's also a good time to pay respect to the estimated 20,000 bodies buried 5 feet below the surface. Yes, that's grim, sorry. Over the next 100 years, this spot housed many working class tenants, as well as a rotation of grocery stores and shoe shops, what you'd expect, until it was auctioned off in 1902. Enter evil landlord number 1. Now, the building that stands today is an altered Renaissance revival constructed around 1903 for one Jacob Feinlight. Sounds like a lovely chap, doesn't it? I couldn't actually find a picture of him, so this one will have to do. Now, I did a little digging on Mr. Feinlight, and what I found was an endless trove of property purchases and lawsuits. Now, many are what you would have expected, right? Disputes over property lines, etc. But he takes them to a whole other level. At one point, he and his wife sued his own mother after scamming her out of their family property. And later, his wife in turn sued him after he forged documents in her name, signed away all of her property without her knowledge, and locked her out of her own house. He was not very kind. Now, he also played a role in gentrification efforts of the historical 5 Points neighborhood earlier. He owned a clothing store on Baxter Street. But in typical Jacob Feinlight fashion, he ended up forging over 40 grand in checks to his competitors, and he had to hand over that property. Now, The only other activity I could find for 29 Cornelia Street between then and the birth of the cafe in the 70s was during Prohibition, when the site was busted for storing massive amounts of wine and counterfeit permits in the basement. I guess they didn't have the bricked off windows that Eric talked about earlier. Yeah, if only, they might not have gotten caught. But Anthony Cassese, known as the king of bootleggers, was behind the ordeal. They arrested a few people on site and they seized all the fake permits. But when the DOJ came back to check on things, they found that the wine press was fully operational again. And they tried to catch the men on site, but they all ran off before they could get to them. Now, I wanted to also share that during my research, I came across another fun article involving Anthony Cassese on another trial for another charge. There was a jury who was basically instructed by the judge to taste the evidence that they found to confirm that it was in fact whiskey. This was during the Prohibition, by the way. Now, there were no glasses. They just passed the bottle along the jury and they all took a swig. And then they were sent to lunch, of course, and it was reported on the front page of the Times that the evidence somehow just disappeared. That was funny.
I love that story. That's such a gem of a find, Becca. Right? I mean, prize to you for coming up with that.
That's what I'm here for. It's the weird stuff. But needless to say, the origin of this building comes from one of our like early money hungry New York City landlords, right? And lots of booze, as we love on this tour. Cornelia Street Cafe, on the other hand, was created by 3 starving artists in the 1970s with nothing more than a toaster oven, a cappuccino maker, which they used to steam eggs, of course, and a dream. Now, the dream originally was to actually bring Hungarian pastries to the village, but fortunately for all of us, these things don't always go as planned. Now, it is important to note that the village was not glamorous at all during this time, and surviving owner Robin Hirsch, whom cafe goers affectionately refer to as the Minister of Culture, described it as pretty grim. If you get a chance to, you should check out his work and his life story. It's absolutely fascinating. Highly recommend it. He actually agreed to help out his actor friend, Charles McKenna, and Charles's girlfriend, Rafaela Pivetta, at the last minute before even seeing the place. Now, what he discovered after signing all of the papers was that it was basically an old antique shop that had been closed for a long time without any running electricity, and local supers had been using it as their own private drinking hole, as well as a bathroom for their dogs. So it didn't look great. It took about 2 months to clean up and renovate, and apparently all of the old supers just sat outside the construction site the whole time, drinking and cursing them all out. But they persevered. In 1977, on the 4th of July, Cornelia Street Cafe opened its doors for the very first time. And it quickly became the progeny to the old cafe houses of the 50s and 60s. It was an indie art space and a haven for local artists in the village. Now, the artists, the owners were all artists themselves from different mediums. So all of the guests and the art forms were varied and eclectic from the very start, which is amazing and so special. Next door actually lived Cafe Chino previously, which was the birthplace of off-Broadway theater. And Hirsch said that he had always felt in a way like he picked up the torch from Joe Chino for the love of art and theater and Greenwich Village. And it became home for a wide and rich and deep community of artists of every shape and size for the next 42 years. Now, with that said, it is impossible to name all of the guests that they had at the cafe, but we're going to cover some of the better known artists who performed here, such as puppeteer and poet Martin Steingesser, man on wire Philippe Petit, that was Petit, Eric, in case you're practicing your French.
Did he go to a salon? A salon?
Ouais.
A petit salon?
Now, every Monday, they also held a songwriters exchange where musicians could perform new works, specifically ones that had only been written that week. And they later produced an album using some of the music that was first performed here at the cafe. A young Jeff Buckley played here. Suzanne Vega debuted a lot of her earlier work here. There were also comedy legends such as Janine Garofalo, John Oliver, John Mulaney, Amy Schumer, Hannibal Buress. It goes on, and they all tested new material at the cafe. We also had Eve Ensler's play, The Vagina Monologues. It was actually launched in the basement of the Cornelia Street Cafe, which as a theater person, that is mind-blowing to me. She did a lot of her plays here, a lot of like interview-based work, and it's said that her play just before the Vagina Monologues involved soldiers from the Kuwait War, which are also known as Dicks, and it was called Dicks in the Desert, appropriately, but it was actually at the bottom of the menu, and so it looked like it was Dicks in the Dessert, which I don't know how appetizing that is for everyone, but you know, to each his own. And then we also had David Amram, who was mentioned earlier, an absolute legend in the music world himself, who played a huge role in the jazz poetry movement, including performing with Jack Kerouac and other beat poets. He was a regular at the cafe. They also hosted the likes of Dr. Oliver Sacks, who read his prose, attorney activist William Kunstler, and Senator and presidential candidate Eugene McCarthy, or the good one, the good McCarthy, as they like to say. They both read their poetry there. And they even opened up the basement originally as the performance space to clean it up for Gene when the senator came. Nobel laureate Roald Hoffman curated a monthly science series there for almost 20 years, and he lovingly referred to it as the Bohemian Cafe of your dreams. And then we had Benjamin Scheuer, who was a cancer survivor, a bard, and novelist, who first premiered his autobiographical song, The Lion, which would later become a one-man show recognized and performed worldwide. Apparently, the night that he performed The Lion at the cafe, he mentioned that he was waiting on his results for whether or not his cancer had gone into remission. And it is said that there was not a dry eye in the house that evening. Fortunately, he is still writing and performing today. Terry Jones from Monty Python also performed excerpts from Eric the Viking, not to be mistaken with our Eric. Do you want to just click that button, Eric?
Yeah, you want me to move ahead? Hold on, let's just linger on a couple of Erics here.
Yeah.
Erics.
Oh, wow. There we go. All right.
You're welcome.
Very nice.
Oh, that's my favorite. Kurt even made it in there.
I even made it.
Oh my God. I think that was my last headshot I ever used.
God.
Oh, it was perfect. I just added the first role. You were like in it. You were ready to go for that role.
I really hope the fur was original to the photo you were in, Eric.
Was it Eric? Was it
No comment. Well played. I did not see that coming. Well played.
I am to please. Now, last but not least, there was also singer and actress Evangelia Kingsley, who has performed a handful of cabarets at the cafe and also happens to be married to one of our tour guides. Does anyone want to raise their hand?
She has, I believe it was said. Go ahead, Kurt.
No, I'm very lucky to be married to the lady on the screen there. Yes.
I believe her father once famously said she has great taste in art and music and questionable taste in men.
Yes, he did say that. And he repeated it several times in my presence to other people. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, he had an understanding.
Towards therapy now. Maybe the next slide will make you smile a little bit. We have a few pop culture icons who were and were not at the cafe that we wanted to talk about and myth bust here. Now, the first you see Dev Patel, of course, from A Scene from Modern Love. He was at the cafe. Taylor Swift famously refers to Cornelia Street in her music several times. However, she rented a condo from 23 Cornelia Street, just a couple buildings down. Lady Gaga is also said to have worked at the cafe as a waitress. However, this has been highly debated, and it is now believed that she actually worked at Palma across the street. So we're going to bust that one. And then Sarah Jessica Parker was a huge fan of the cafe, and she had her very first date with her husband, Matthew Broderick, there.
Can I ask, and sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead there, but when Taylor Swift was when she was living down the street, how much was she paying for rent?
You know, sadly, it was about 40 grand.
A month?
A month. I mean, she had a pool. She had a pool in her condo. So, you know.
I just don't know why the village is just falling apart.
Yeah, you know, there are certain things like commercial stabilization that we might talk about a little bit coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so by the end of the cafe's run, it had served as a launch pad for countless artists. They were hosting over 700 shows per year. They were performing poetry in 14 languages, not all at the same time. They were acclaimed as one of the top spots to go listen to jazz, And they even broke 2 world records, one being the longest piano solo. Any guesses for how long that might have been? 5 hours, 6 hours, 52 hours. Yes, by one person. Crazy, 1,000 songs. Anyway, and the second was the largest number of keyboards played at the same time. And that audience also included Philip Glass. Now, Mayor Ed Koch proclaimed that the cafe, "You are a culinary as well as a cultural landmark, and thanks to you, the tradition of the Greenwich Village Coffee House is alive and well." All right, so how does such a successful cafe like this one go under, you ask? And Eric, kind of gave a nod to this earlier. Unfortunately, this tale ends similarly to how it began. Like many, many other long lost bars, Cornelia Street Cafe fell victim to rising rents in the village. Enter evil landlord number 2, Mark Sharpman. I don't know if I said that right. I didn't spend a lot of time on trying to figure out how to say that. He's notoriously one of the most loathsome New Yorkers, according to the New York Press, and surely countless tenants. And yes, this is the same landlord who brought the Gap to St. Mark's Place, and the same landlord who doubled Cornelia Street Cafe's rent when he acquired the building. Insert booze here. Now, Hirsch tried for years to renegotiate his lease, expand the business, and even rebranded Cornelia Street Underground as a nonprofit to help set back the crazy rent increases. Their rent had grown from $450, which they didn't even know how they'd be able to pay that at the time, to nearly 40 grand per month. Yes, the same cost as Taylor Swift's condo. It's 84 times what they started with. Now, Hirsch puts this into perspective for us with what he refers to as the croissant clause, which basically means they'd have to charge $84 per croissant in order to stay afloat. I don't know about you, I love art, but I am not willing to pay that much for a croissant. In the end, the burden was just too much of the high rents and the legal fees, so they couldn't keep the doors open and they closed on New Year's Day, 2019. But goodbye isn't always forever. Right? Like so many of us have learned in the past couple of years, a physical space doesn't necessarily need to define our experience. So to use, we have a cat joining us too, but to use Hirsch's favorite image, like a phoenix rising out of the ashes, great art often comes from great devastation. So since closing its doors, Hirsch and other Cornelia Street conspirators have been producing pop-up events called Cornelia Street in Exile to keep the spirit of the cafe alive all over. So be on the lookout for those. You can find them on their Facebook page. I know I, for one, greatly look forward to seeing what comes next for Cornelia Street in Exile. And the last slide is just our last tour there before the bar closed.
Oh.
And it's sad because we just started reintroducing it in our route. We'd started working it back in because we had left it for a while and it was right before they closed. So we only got in there a few more times, a few lucky patrons.
Yeah, very special location. Yeah.
Well, there is one that has not yet succumbed to evil landlords in New York, but it's certainly no longer on our tour for other reasons, both for good and bad. And we have no ill will because it is a beautiful space. And Rose, I believe you should take this away.
Yeah. So our last bar we're going to visit this evening, and bear with us. I know we're at time, but stay with us. I promise it's worth it. Minetta Tavern, which is located at 113 McDougal Street in the Village, was first opened in 1937. It replaced a speakeasy that was called the Black Rabbit, which had closed about 8 years before. It was open for just a couple of years, as many of the speakeasies were. As Eric mentioned, they kind of popped up out of nowhere and then swiftly would go away again. So when the Minetta came in 1937, its owner, Eddie Salieri, who actually later took his name from the restaurant, he went by Eddie Minetta, was actually taking his name from the tavern, which in turn was taking its name from a stream that had run through the area many years before. And if you advance forward, yeah, there we go. That's a map just kind of showing the original appearance of the creek in Manhattan at that time. It was actually called by the Native Americans who lived there at one time the Manete, which meant devil's water. And unfortunately, if you want to see it now, you're actually going to have to go several feet down through a manhole, which many streams that actually ran through Manhattan had the same fate of. They're underneath the surface because they had to brick up the place in order to further expand, further build, and that sort of thing. But I mentioned that Manete meant devil's water, and that's pretty fitting because Minetta Tavern opened in Prohibition's wake, like I said, 1937, and it served as a drinking hole for local artists and authors such as Cleon Throckmorton, Lillian Hellman, Ernest Hemingway. Sorry, I couldn't resist putting this in here. He probably didn't look that way when he was at the tavern, just to be fair, but had to put it in. And then, of course, since it's literary pub crawl, we couldn't do anything without our friend Dylan Thomas, who, my God, son, like, how many places have you been to already tonight? So Dylan Thomas was also a regular there as well. But the Minetta also became a hub for a group of proto-beat poets who called themselves the Ravens. They took their name from Poe's poem and met there and published poetry in what became known as the Raven Anthology Journal, which was published between 1933 and 1940. Among them was Maxwell Bodenheim, who was a poet probably best known for the line, "Greenwich Village is the Coney Island of the soul," which inspired the title of fellow beatnik Lawrence Ferlinghetti's most famous work, "A Coney Island of the Mind." It's the kind of line that, sounds profound until you really think about it. Comparing one neighborhood of New York to another neighborhood of New York, it's like saying Park Slope is the Upper West Side of the heart, or Staten Island is the Jersey City of the pancreas, both of which are true, to be fair. But Bodenheim's memoir, a little swirly there. Bodenheim's memoir does give you a good idea of what the village was like at the time. In particular, the celebrity that tended to follow notable writers around when they would come to the village. He described a visit by Gertrude Stein in 1933. She was held in such awe by the local writers that everyone was too nervous to laugh at a rather ridiculous moment. He writes, "When she rose and spoke, the effect was tremendous, as if a statue had come to life. The chairman was so unnerved that he introduced the celebrated Miss Stein as Albert Einstein. There was not the mirth you might have expected at the slip of the tongue." So, but by the 1950s, the beat movement had reached its peak. But alas, Bodenheim himself had become a drunk, sleeping on benches. And in 1954, tragically, he was murdered in a flop house on the Bowery. So very uncool, man. But sorry, that was my impersonation of a beatnik. So we can move right along. Now, another regular at Minetta around this time was E.E. Cummings. You may have heard of before, a poet. Before coming to New York, Cummings had received his BA and his MA at Harvard in the years leading up to World War I. He then worked as an ambulance driver in France and was actually interned in a prison camp by the French for his outspoken anti-war convictions. He later recounted these experiences in his novel, The Enormous Room. But as you may know, if you've come across his work, Cummings experimented radically with form, punctuation, spelling, and syntax, abandoning traditional techniques and structures to create a new type of poetic expression. Later in his career, he was criticized for kind of following the same pattern over and over again. Nevertheless, at the time of his death in 1962, he was still the second most widely read poet in the United States, after Robert Frost. But I bring up Cummings, I have to confess, for selfish reasons, because it allows me to segue to one of our very favorite Minetta regulars, which was, of course, the Greenwich Village barfly and fringe literary player, Joe Gould, who also happens to be over Eric's shoulder. Yep.
Yeah, right. Right there. There it is, from Chumley's.
Quite a character. So he was a Harvard graduate who became a bohemian dropout by the 1930s, wandering about, essentially scoring free meals and drinks from other artists and residents of the village. Bodenheim, we talked about, himself described Gould as having a tonsured head, piebald, ecclesiastical beard, and bent, shrunken frame, like a fugitive from a medieval monastery. Gould's claim, indefinitely, was that he was working on a 9 million word oral history of the world. He was also perhaps the most controversial member of the Ravens, mentioned previously, and purportedly roamed the village with a sign that read, "Joseph Ferdinand Gould, hotshot poet from Poetville, a refugee from the Ravens. Poets of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your brains. Yet, despite his eccentricities, or more likely because of them, Joe Gould gathered the admiration of more famous writers throughout his time in the village. A human capybara, as I like to think. I'll let that land for a second. In fact, Joe Gould garnered a lot of credibility as a writer because of his friendships with writers such as Cummings, as we mentioned, also Ezra Pound, Eugene O'Neill, and did I skip anybody? Yeah, I think that's it. No, wait,
think so.
He's the first.
But I love that you can't find a picture of Eugene O'Neill without his resting bitch face. This is the,
No,
like the most
absolutely.
biggest smile I've ever seen him in a picture right here.
Yeah, this was the least severe I could find, unfortunately, if you can imagine. There's just like a little glimmer of a smile. But anyway, these were his buddies. He had a long and bizarre friendship with Cummings, much of it to do with Minetta Tavern, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, featured on the screen, you see one of my absolute favorite writers about New York, Joseph Gould, excuse me, his friend, Joseph Mitchell, who was a journalist and worked for the New Yorker. And he was the one who really brought Gould to the public's attention when he wrote a New Yorker article about Joe Gould called Professor Siegel in 1942. Gould earned the nickname because on request and for the cost of a beer or two, he'd do a pretty convincing impersonation of the seagull. That's all there is to it. So, but hey, take next time you're in the crowd, could be a crowd pleaser. So the article made Gould an international celebrity for a while. In fact, several of his friends were able to actually convince a wealthy woman to agree to, and for a long time, anonymously pay his rent and give him an allowance. Now, part of me would love to say her identity is still unknown, not least of which is because I'd like to invoke my inner Robert Stack of unsolved mysteries. But her identity finally came to light actually a few years ago as one Muriel Gardner, a fellow lover of literature and daughter to a wealthy Middle Western family. She has a storied history of her own, but alas, Minetta was not one of her hotspots, and so we have to leave her there for now, the long anticipated benefactress of the village's panhandling poet. Now, it might come as no surprise that Mitchell later discovered that Gould hadn't actually really written much of any of his 9 million word oral history of the world. 7 years after Gould's death, Mitchell wrote another New Yorker piece divulging the secret, later inspiring actually a film by Stanley Tucci in the late 90s, I think, called Joe Gould's Secret. It's good. I watched it last night for research purposes, and it's fantastic. It's really good. I think it's on Roku or some random thing like that. But anyway, after exposing the lie, Mitchell apparently went back to his desk job and oddly enough, never wrote another word himself. But I should mention that Mitchell's conclusion that there's no oral history has been called into dispute recently by Jill Lepore, who wrote a book called Joe Gould's Teeth. However, to date, no manuscript has actually been found. A sliver of Gould's writing does survive to this day, however. Quietly tucked away within NYU's archives are 11 dime store composition books that make up a nearly 150,000 word diary, one of which apparently was unknown to Mitchell. His diary is often mechanical, day-to-day account of his life from the years 43 to 47, focusing mainly on what he ate and where and other such mundane aspects of his life in the village. An excerpt reads, June 7th, 1946. I saw Belle de Triomphant. He said he had a pair of shoes for me. I had an ale at the Minetta. June 8th. De Triomphant had not brought the shoes. I had a drink at the Minetta. June 11th. I saw de Triomphant. He had the shoes for me. I took them. I went to the Minetta. I drank. June 12th. I went to Goodies. I had some beers. I lost my shoe. I went to the Minetta. All of which I think should give any one of us hope that one day our uninspired, somewhat meandering journal entries might live in the annals of a prestigious academic institution. There you go.
A poor institution.
Lord, I'd still love to read them, but maybe not all of it. So he had some, yeah, right. He had some good lines. He said of the rats that he'd seen traveling in packs in the early mornings before dawn. I sometimes believe these rats are not rats at all, but the damned and aching souls of tenement landlords. And he said of the typewriter that William Shakespeare didn't sit around pecking on a dirty, damned $95 doohickey, and Joe Gould doesn't either. But as I mentioned, Cummings and Gould had a unique friendship, likely stemming back to their days matriculating at Harvard. In New York, Cummings became something of a protector for Gould, even lending him clothes on occasion. Cummings wrote a poem or two about him and mentioned him in several other poems. One reads, Little Joe Gould has lost his teeth and doesn't know where to find them, and found a secondhand set which click. Little Gould used to amputate his appetite with bad brittle candy, but just nude eel. Now little Joe lives on air. That's just a part of it. I won't read the whole thing. You can see the rest of it. But it gives you an idea of how influential this little capybara was on his artist friends. So there you have it. The artists and authors who found their inspiration at the little tavern named for the little street, named for the little stream in the heart of the village. The Minetta, as mentioned, is one of our standouts on this tour, as it continues in operation to this day, evoking the old village. You'll still find the walls covered with photographs of famous patrons and caricatures, about 20 of which artist Franz Klein scrawled in exchange for drink and food. I should remind you that Franz Klein was the one that Jackson Pollock threw a door at one point. But in any case, this photo here demonstrates essentially what Minetta looks like now when it's fully crowded. And so that's why we can't go there anymore.
This looks a lot like the 100,000 speakeasies that popped up.
Yeah.
I love that somehow this was collectively a theme of ours. Like, how many things can I cram in one slide?
Well, apparently this photo is supposed to invoke anxiety for people who have which, I mean, I get it. Like, my thought is like, where's the bathroom? Like anytime I'm in a crowd.
I'm looking for Waldo.
Yeah. So anyway, that's why we can't go there anymore. We can't fit. This is the Minetta behind me, as you can see.
Oh.
But yeah, just imagine all those people in here. It is beautiful though. And it's
so I went back one because if you look at the photo on the left, that's what it looked like up until we stopped going there. They've replaced the tables there with some booths, whatnot, but you can kind of just barely see at the very top right corner. If you can see, can you see my mouse? This was a painting of Gould that used to be up there that when the new owners took over, they removed it.
They removed it, yeah.
And there was some blogs of people who were trying to find it. I don't know if we've ever secured it, but my guess is the owner probably has it somewhere. But I mean, I was like, spent too much money on this stuff. My mom doesn't need to know how much I've spent on this stuff, but I was like, I want that painting.
Yeah,
I want it because I appreciate this.
Bring Robert Stack back. We need his power. He used to scare the crap out of me, but that's an aside. I used to think that like the murderer was outside my door whenever he spoke.
Oh God.
Yeah. But anyway, that's another story.
Well, if you enjoyed it, we do thank you. I know we ran a little bit longer than normal today, but we do get very passionate about some of the things we talk about and spending time with each other. But you can follow us on social media. We're not the best of it, and I'm morally object to what a lot of social media has done to our society and our youth. But yet it is a means of, so whenever we have an event, we will post it on social media. You can also find you can search for us on YouTube and find some of our past episodes that we've done, and our website literarypubcrawl.com, which you can sign up for our email list, which we'll send one less than once a month because we're not very good at it, and we don't want to flood your inbox, and we only let you know if there's something really interesting or one of these virtual tours for you to sign up with, which is where I think the majority of you joined us here. But thank you. You can, if you like, you can tip us, and you can find these links on our website at literarypubcrawl.com. Certainly every tip is appreciated. We look forward to Kurt's bill when we send him his invoice, but for the rest of us, it certainly is appreciated. But on that note, if you do have any other questions, I see that the chats are starting to kind of kick in here. But really much time spending with all these New York wiseacres. Logan sounds like my kind of guy. I like that, but
I'm sorry, that just clicked. That's is this a coincidence? Isn't that the what's the show? Oh my God, about the family that's trying to destroy each other, the business family. You know what I'm talking about? Succession. Your friend is the same name as the guy from Succession, so I don't know.
Maybe it's
Succession, yeah, thank you guys.
Yes, there it is.
I only just watched the entire silly thing.
Can you find the t-shirt on there? I think we have it online. We're supposed to have it online. Check or email me if you don't see it there. I know I was setting up there at one point to try to do all that. It's a surprising a lot of work trying to do all of this stuff, especially when you have full-time jobs. Yeah, we do have them. They can be ordered. I think they're on our website.
We also have beer glasses too.
Yes.
That's true. Those are a little pricey to mail.
Oh yeah, don't.
We do have them.
Talk them out of it, Eric.
Yeah, I know.
They're not. They don't hold drink.
They're terrible. They just spill all over you when you try to drink it. We would also ask if you do enjoy it, let some other people know about it. That's when we were live, that was our best means of advertising, was still word of mouth, and we're finding that's true still now. Just letting people know that this might be something they're interested in. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'm supposed to say. Becca, what else am I supposed to say?
You're just supposed to say that you really love doing it. It's worth all the time. And
I really love doing it. It's worth all the time.
Great. Something about American culture and what was
camaraderie. Yes, Bygone Bar is a story of American culture and camaraderie. And it will continue to have the same spirit and storytelling and passion that these have. But in the meantime, we will probably continue these for as long as we can, because we do really enjoy this side of it. And we'll see what next medium will bring for us. We might bring Kurt back. Depends how quickly he pays his bill. Austin, we miss.
You decide.
Yeah, you decide. Yeah, exactly. Thumbs up, thumbs down, real quick.
My life is in your hands.
But I think on that note, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all of your time. We'll see you on the next one. Stay warm. Get outside. Exercise. Call your mother. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Trying to inspire at the end. Exercise, eat right, low calories, cut back your sugar. Call your mom.
Drink your water.
Drink your water.
Yeah.
Green leafy vegetables.
Cheers. Read a book, not a Kindle.
All right, bye guys.